Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Nick Cortina here with Exago to bring you another exciting support lab, this time on storage management and customization. Now, before we keep going, you folks know the drill. Just give me a Y or a yes in the questions pane. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me all right and everyone can see my screen before we get going. Okay, great. And it looks like everyone can hear me and see the screen, so we're all set to get started. Thank you folks so much for joining me today. We've got a lot of great content that we're going to go through. And one thing that I want to be really upfront about, today's lab is going to be very technical in nature. So this is your formal code warning that we're going to be diving pretty deep into some C#, a little bit of JavaScript. We're looking primarily at the back end and the configuration of Exago. We're going to have a brief demo of some things in the front end, but the focus today is really on how we actually set all of this up and get everything working behind the scenes. So if that's not something that's of interest to you, I just want to make sure that we're very upfront with sort of what the content of today's lab is going to be around. So what are we actually going to talk about? Well, first, we're going to dive into getting started with storage management customization in general. Where would we go and what do we do if we actually want to get our hands on the storage management source code so we can tweak, tailor, modify to satisfy any number of different use cases that you might have in your system. Beyond that, we're going to look at a very specific example. This is where we're going to spend most of the time on today's lab of an implementation of a favorites folder, effectively allowing users to move a report to and from a favorites folder. And at the very end, we're going to spend some time for interactive Q&A. And just one thing, speaking of questions, if you've got any really tailored or environment-specific questions, anything about, hey, in my environment, how might I do X or things of that nature, those types of questions aren't going to be the sort of thing that we really want to discuss today with the group on this lab. That said, I definitely would encourage you to submit a services ticket with us, so that's something we can follow up with you on and have a one-on-one discussion. So with that in mind, where do we actually get started here? Well, on the downloads page. And this is actually something that should seem fairly familiar, particularly if you've worked with, say, our precursor to storage management, folder management. The mechanism or the path that you would go through to actually get and access that source code is kind of very similar to what we're doing with storage management here. This zip is going to be the full storage management source code, which you can then take as a Visual Studio project and go through all the different classes to tweak and tailor methods to make sure that their implementation fits your use case. Now, you could really sort of expand this out in any given direction. So one thing I'd encourage you to do is, as we go through the lab today, while sure, it's going to be great to see this specific example in action, try to focus in on some of the different parts and pieces that I'm implementing and think about how you might extrapolate those to different and other use cases that you might have for your system. So for today's example, we're going to be looking at the implementation of a favorites folder. So the objective here is to add a right-click menu option so that users can move reports to and from a favorites folder. Now, some things to mention about this example. This is actually going to be going to an actual client, and in this client's environment, reports and folders are exposed as read-only to end users. One thing we can consider here is we could modify this example further to account for some additional use cases, perhaps ones in which we've got an environment where there are some read-only folders and reports and some things that users might be building out on their own. That's something we certainly could consider. We just want to make sure that we're accounting for those in the actual implementation itself as we go. One other thing here, as part of the setup, I'm not going to show this on the lab today, but we do need to actually create this favorites folder and assign the relevant permissions ahead of time. So in this case, we're going to be using the access flag in the content access table. We're going to be setting that value to 480 across the board. That's going to be present on all of our folders and reports, including the favorites folder. And that effectively means users are going to be able to run all the given reports in the system, but they're not going to be able to edit any of those given reports. Another thing that we're going to do on the favorites folder specifically is assign a sort order of 999. And the reason why we're going to do that is out of the box with storage management, you'll probably notice that in the content access table, all of the records are going to have default sort order of 0. That means when they come into the system in the folder tree, things should show up in alphabetical order if they all have matching sort order. In this case, the client environment, and part of the reason why we're setting this up is this client's environment has lots of nested folders, has lots and lots of reports, and some of the users have reports that they execute on a regular basis that they sometimes don't remember where to go to find them. And we've got the search bar, but they would prefer to be able to just add these to a favorites folder so they could easily access them every time they get into the system. With that in mind, assigning this sort order of 999 ensures that this favorites folder shows up at the very top of the list above all other folders in the system. So when a user does go down through the nested folder tree and finds a given report and adds it to this folder, the next time they come into the system, it's going to be really easy for them to find because it's right at the top of their report tree. There's going to be a number of setup steps that go into this and lots of different parts and pieces. I'm going to show these on the slides here today. I don't want to be flipping back and forth from admin console to Notepad++ and sifting through my file system. So I'm just going to show some quick screenshots and talk a little bit about where all these specific settings are going to come into play and which files we actually have to modify. If there's anything that you'd like me to review, again, please feel free to just post a question in that pane. We're going to keep that open as we go through here. One of the first things that we have to do is add some additional language elements, and these are going to be by way of a custom language file. If you've worked with our previous folder management samples, this should seem fairly similar. In this case, you'll notice that I've added this ENUS extensibility, and we can see the screenshot of that file down below. I've actually just got two custom language elements. These are going to come into play on the actual right-click menu of reports. In the actual report tree, we're going to see that when we right-click a report, we'll get an option to add a report to the favorites folder. If a report's in that favorites folder, we'll be able to right-click to see an option to remove that report from the favorites folder. Both of these items we're going to include in the language file so that our code base can reference these values from the language files instead of using static content in the code base. Now, the other thing just to keep in mind is once we create this language file and add these language elements, and again, the two language elements could be customized to sort of whatever language you see fit for this type of thing. I'm using add to favorites, remove from favorites. You could change that to whatever you want. That would just be down here. But once we add this content to this custom language file, we need to make sure we add that language file reference in the language file settings located in main settings, and that's in our admin console. From there, a couple other things we have to do. We're going to need to make sure that we actually save the content ID of the favorites folder, and that's going to get saved in the app settings.config file. This is located in the base Exago web application install directory. The reason why we're going to save this ID here is because we're going to actually reference that ID value a number of different times in the actual implementation behind the scenes. And we want to make sure that that's not something that we're sort of copy and pasting this static string around from a variety of different places. So another thing I would just mention here, if you've worked with folder management previously, this should actually seem fairly similar to when you actually assigned the table names in folder management, and we had to set those in our app settings file back there. You'll notice with storage management, we don't have to do any of that assigning of the table names or anything in the app settings. That's all sort of baked into the system. This is something that we're only going to do in this case where I'm doing this favorites folder implementation. In addition to that change, I also wanted to add a couple icons because in the right-click menu, when we show these new menu options, I wanted to have some simple icons that that sort of give a little bit of visual flair to the favorite and remove from favorites, or as I've coined it here, unfavorite action. So you'll notice that in my active application theme, I added these two SVG icons. These are just simple icons that I found on Google for the case of this demonstration. We'll actually notice as well that in the code base, I reference these icons by file path, and I use the PNG extension. One thing just to keep in mind is if your Exago implementation is configured to use the SVG icons instead of the PNGs, even though we specify by PNG later on in the code, it'll go and grab the SVGs instead. Now, this setting I actually want to take an extra second with because this setting is one of the most critical changes that we're going to make. While a lot of the other nuance and specifics that I'm showing for this example are tailored to this specific example, This change is something that every user who decides to customize storage management is going to have to go through. And I really shouldn't say every user there. Every client or every administrator who decides that they're going to do this customization will have to go through this specific step. By default, in the storage management settings of your implementation, you're going to see this assembly location pointing to the bin directory of the Exago web installation. And that's because by default, there is a compiled storage management code base that ships with every installation of Exago. So the default is going to point to that built-in base storage management sample that comes with Exago. But once we download that source code and start to modify it, eventually, we'll get to a point where our changes are complete. We'll rebuild that project and produce a new DLL with the compiled custom storage management assembly. Once that's completed, we need to tell Exago to look at the custom storage management assembly as opposed to the one that's residing in the bin directory that has not been customized. So to that end, you'll see here that I've updated my assembly location to point to the new storage management code base that currently just lives in my downloads folder. And I know that the path is a little bit long, so I just included that down below to give you that full path example. Another thing I would mention here is this class name. If we went into the code base and actually customized it such that this class name was going to be different for where the actual storage management methods are residing, we would want to make sure that that change is also reflected here in the admin console settings. In this case, I've not modified that class name information, so I'm not making that change here. But again, something that's worth mentioning if you are going to go ahead and modify any of the class name information. And actually, there was a great question that came in. I want to just take a moment to bring to the group. The question is, if there's the same favorites folder according to the ID, how do we ensure that users can't see reports that they're not supposed to see? And it looks like Travis just responded to that question privately. But one of the things that we're going to see in just a second is these specific content access records that we're going to add for that favorites folder are going to be user specific. And that's what actually ensures that when one user moves one of these reports up from some folder to the favorites folder, that any other user won't actually see that report in the favorites folder. For any other user, it'll still show up in that base folder location. And the reason why is because, again, the new content access records are going to have a party type at the user level. And the party ID that we'll assign is going to be the user ID value that's active for that current session. And very explicitly there, that user ID value is going to come from the storage management identity parameter user ID, not the base Exago user ID parameter. That's a very important distinction that I just want to make sure I mention there. So just to keep moving, at this point, there's some additional configuration that's going to be required. With this specific piece of the configuration, we are going to assume that the changes we'll see in just a moment in the code base have actually already been completed. So in this case, we're going to notice in my code base, I've added 2 additional classes to storage management by way of an action events class and by way of a favorites class. Once those 2 classes have all their methods generated and that code is compiled and the new DLL is created, I'm going to actually create a couple of additional data sources in Exago. This is something we'll do in the Exago admin console. So in the admin console, we're going to add 2 data sources, one for each of these 2 classes that I've chosen to add. We'll see here that very similar to if you've worked, again, with folder management or used server or action events in an external assembly, the way to configure these data sources is going to be the same. And I'm just including another full path example down here for you to take a look at. Now, once those data sources have been added, we actually want to reference some of the methods within those classes as events within Exago. Now, I'm actually going to start with this bottommost event, the right click. Again, if you've worked with folder management, this should look pretty familiar. The on tree node right click set right click menu event is something that we heavily utilized in the folder management samples prior to storage management. In this case, we're going to actually reuse that here. And this is what's going to actually hijack the right click when we right click on given reports in the system and allow us an opportunity to make modifications to what shows up in that right-click menu. In addition, that's going to give us the ability to perform server-side callbacks from the right-click menu options. Now, the important thing to note there is for us to be able to call specific methods as server callbacks, they actually need to be configured as events in Exago. And to that end, that's why you'll notice that the other two events that we're adding, and these are all action events, are add to favorites and remove from favorites. We'll see those both come from the favorites class in the assembly, as we've added that as a data source. The bottom one comes from action events, and we'll see the implementation of these methods in just a moment. But another thing to note here is that both add to favorites and remove from favorites do not have assigned event or global event types. And part of the reason why that is because these are just going to be used as callback methods in conjunction with the right-click menu modifications that we'll be making. These are not action events that we're going to apply anywhere else in the system. They're only going to be called by our custom right-click menu options. And now let's go actually look at some code and see how this thing is actually going to come together behind the scenes. So I'm going to jump out here for a second. And let's actually just go over real quick and we can see what this behavior looks like in action. So at this point, I'm a user logged into the system. I've got some given number of folders. We can see the favorites folder showing up at the top of the list here. Again, that's because of that sort order property that we mentioned. And we've got this public folder and I've got some amount of nested reports here, some nested folders. You can imagine that with lots and lots more reports and folders in a structure like this, it could be pretty easy for me to lose my place and maybe not recall where certain specific reports are. With that in mind, when I go click my right-click menu here, we can see that on any given report, I've now got this additional option that says add to favorites. And when I go ahead and click, we'll see that's going to throw a debugger that I've got in the code. So for now, I'll just cancel the debugging. We'll see that that's going to throw a nice little dialog that tells me that this report was added to favorites and that I can refresh to see my changes. So I'll dismiss. I'm going to refresh. That's going to do a fresh pull of the report tree. And now when we expand this favorites folder, we'll see that this advanced report is now present here. And I can go ahead and run that report. Now, another thing to keep in mind is in the favorites folder, from here, I could go ahead and choose to remove something from favorites. And when I do that, it's going to notify me again that this was removed from favorites. I'll hit dismiss. And when I refresh for a fresh pull of the report tree, we'll see that my favorites folder is empty again. Now, one other thing that we can show as the question came in, let's say I were to add this first report to favorites. I'm going to cancel the debugger again. We'll refresh. We'll observe that that is in the favorites folder. Let's jump over to the admin console for a moment, and I'm going to actually modify this user ID value. And again, this is an identity parameter in the storage management configuration block. So let's say that I'm user 2. I'll apply this change. We're going to refresh Exago here. Oh, and it looks like I think I had actually added this for this user previously. So I'm just going to dismiss that. And now this favorites is empty. Let's go back to user 1 and just confirm that we should still see that in the favorites folder for the other user. And we see that here. And we can flip back to user 2 and just confirm that they still no longer see that in favorites. And we can see that's empty again. We had another question come in. If we update the report in the favorite folder, would it update the original report? And to that end, I just want to reiterate that one of the initial things we talked about for this specific environment is that users don't actually have access to editing reports in this system. So in this case, because there's no editing capabilities, there's not going to be any potential for a user to edit a report that they've added to that favorites folder. And that's something that we design explicitly by virtue of the the access flags component of the content access records. So the key thing to keep in mind there is because the access flags are set to 480 when we move that report over to favorites, that's what ensures that that when a report is in this folder, a user still isn't going to have access to change anything about that report. So
Nick, can I expand on that just for one moment?
Sure.
So in this example, if a user did have a report that they did have permission to edit, and then they marked that report as a favorite, if they made changes to that and other users were able to see that report, those changes would apply because the report itself, the content, is not changing just because it's moving into a different folder.
Yep, and Travis is exactly right there. So if for some reason you did want to architect a system such that once that report was moved over, it could still be updated and modified for other given users, that's certainly something that you could choose to implement. Again, for this example, we don't want that behavior, and that's why in this case, we're not going to see that in this environment. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio so we can take a look at the actual code behind all of this. And so here we're going to start in the action events class. Now, this content database project or solution, I should say, that you can see here is the actual storage management code base that you can download directly from our support site. Now, I just want to mention that by default, you're not going to see these action event or favorites classes in this project. These are classes that I added for this implementation specifically. So looking at the action events class, we'll actually notice first there's this load JS code helper method. This should look very similar if you've worked with folder management. This is actually just ripped straight from some of the old folder management projects that we utilized. And all this method's going to do is allow us to go and grab JavaScript code from our resources to actually load them up so we can reference them in the session. And the JavaScript's going to be where we do the right-click menu options. The other thing I'll mention here is the on tree node right-click set right-click menu method. Again, this should look very similar if you've worked with this in folder management. Here, I've only made a couple simple changes to this method. First, I'm going and grabbing that favorites folder ID. And again, as we recall, that's coming from the app settings in the Exago web application base directory where we added that key for the favorites folder ID. I'm going to go ahead and set up the JavaScript action for the session, and I'm going to use the load JS code helper method to get the set node right-click menu JavaScript file. I'm also then going to format a call to the set right-click menu function that we'll see in the JavaScript there. And then we're going to have the fav folder ID be passed in to set right-click menu. And that's going to be what allows us to conditionally decide whether or not we click on a report if it's in the favorites folder or if it's not in the favorites folder. And that's going to determine whether or not we want to show either add to favorites or remove from favorites. So from there, this is going to actually load up this JavaScript action when the session starts. And then what's going to happen is the action event, which is configured on the right-click menu, is going to fire that JavaScript when we do the right-click menu in the actual front end. So when we perform that right-click, we're going to run this JavaScript code file, which again is loaded using that helper method we saw before. This is actually added as a resource to this project in the Properties tab. And we'll see that we'll call the set right-click menu function. We're going to pass in that favorites folder ID. The first thing we're going to do is get some information about the selected node. And then effectively from there, we're going to confirm whether or not this is a report, because if it's a folder, we don't want to do any changes to that right-click menu. So in this case, we're first going to confirm, is this actually a report? And then if so, we're going to go get some parent node information based on that given report. And effectively this parent node, and more importantly, the parent node's UDF, is what allows us to inspect the content ID of the folder of the report we selected and compare it against the favorites folder's content ID. And that's what tells us if the report we selected is already in the favorites folder or if it's in some other folder on the system. So if the equivalence relation here comes back as true, that would mean that the folder of the report we selected is not the favorites folder. So we want to go ahead and add a menu item that allows us to add it to favorites. And you'll see here, this is where we're specifying that particular image that we're going to grab as well. Now, if the content is already in the favorites folder, that means we want to add the option to remove from favorites. And that's where we're going to have the unfavorite icon, as I called it, as we saw back in the images in the slides. Scrolling just a little bit down, this is where we're going to actually set the onClick function that's going to execute for this new favorite option that we're creating in the menu. And again, in here, the key thing that we need to make sure we're doing is setting the right callback method based on whether or not the report is already in the favorites folder. So we're again going to parse information about the parent node, which is effectively the folder the report lives in. And from there, we're once again going to check if that parent content ID is equal to the favorites folder ID. And if it's not, we're going to do a callback to add to favorites. And that very specifically, I just want to mention here, this add to favorites that we can see needs to match the casing that we input for the add to favorites callback method in the Exago admin console. So it doesn't necessarily need to match the name of the method we'll see in the favorites class here in just a second. It needs to actually match the name in the admin console when we add that as an action event with no event types. The things we're going to pass to this callback method are the actual content ID of the report that was selected. That's going to be relevant because that's necessary for the content access record that we're going to be inserting. The other thing we're going to pass is the report name. Now, you might be thinking, well, we have the report ID. Why do we care about the report name? That's a great question. And the only reason we actually care about the report name is so we can notify the user that we just went ahead and moved that report to the favorites folder for them. Now, again, if this is something that's in the favorites folder already, then we want to give the option to remove from favorites. And we're again going to pass that content ID and that given report name. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we clean up that favorite menu item once we click out of the report right-click menu. So from there, after making one of the selections, we're going to go to the appropriate callback method. Now again, these names correspond to the admin console names. So there's almost sort of a two-step jump process, if you will, in going from server callback to admin console add to favorites method. Admin console add to favorites is connected to our favorites class and then connected to the add to favorites method here. Now, I think it looked like these two had the same name, but I will just highlight that the remove favorite report, this method in the favorites class is remove favorite report, and set node right click here says remove from favorites. So even though this name and this name don't line up, the link in the admin console is what allows everything to work together smoothly, despite the fact that these two items aren't named identically. So once we decide to call add to favorites, we've got session info at that point, which allows us to look at information in the session, which is going to be relevant in just a second here. We've got that report ID and the report name. We can see here's the debugger that was launching when I was demoing the behavior. And from there, we're going to grab the actual storage config, and that's going to actually come from setup data in session info. And the reason why we want to do it this way is we want to make sure that any changes to, say, identity parameters or modifications to any other storage management configuration that happened for this specific session are things that are going to be taken into account in our storage management database object that we're creating just down below. And that's why, as you can see, we're passing in that storage config to the storage management database constructor here. Now, another thing that you're going to notice, I'm doing the brunt of my work in the actual storage management database class. And you might be saying, well, why didn't I just sort of implement everything out here in the add to favorites method in the favorites class? And the reason why we're going to do that, and so at this point, we'll jump over to the storage management database class so we can see this add favorite method. You'll notice we're going to pass in the report ID here. If we jump over and we look at this add favorite method, the reason why I've chosen to add this method here is because there are a number of different members of the storage management database class that actually have access modifiers that are set to private by default. So from my perspective, that sort of left me with a choice. I could either modify that those members to have an access level of public, so I could access them in other classes. But from my perspective, I think it's a little bit safer to use the favorites class as an entry point into our storage management database class. And from there, this will allow us to access some of those private members in a way that's a little bit more controlled. So we don't necessarily need to expose additional content. We can just go directly into the storage management database class. Now, one other thing I'll note is this is the class that actually has most of the base content for storage management. So a lot of examples that you might choose or decide you want to build out, you can actually look at some of the other methods that you'll see up above here to get a little bit more examples on how you might perform certain actions. That's something you can just keep in mind if you've got other specific things that you need to do in storage management here. Now again, once we get to this add favorite method, we'll see that I'm going to grab the favorites folder from the app settings. And again, that's that favorites folder ID key that we assigned in the app settings block. I've also got the access table name here. I don't see this being something that a lot of folks should really be changing. There's always a potential that someone will, and you could certainly modify how you populate the content access table name. You could also modify this to take some of the prefixes into account as well. I believe I actually saw a lot of that information in session info. So if for some reason you felt the need to pass some of that information around, that would likely be something that you'd want to specify in the favorites class or whatever other alternate class you're using to pass information into the storage management database class. Now from here, this is fairly self-explanatory, but we'll go through it quick. We're going to construct a new DB query object. And from here, we're going to actually construct the SQL that will insert a new content access record so that whatever given report was selected will now show up in the favorites folder. So we'll see here that I'm passing the access table name in. We're going to go and grab the most restrictive party type. If you don't change this method out of the box, this should go and grab you user level access, and that's effectively the most granular level of access that's going to be present in storage management. So generally speaking, in a system like what we've seen here, the base reports are all going to have, generally speaking, either everyone or company level access, and this most restrictive party type in conjunction with the current user ID that we'll also be passing in, this is going to be populated correctly because we pass the storage management config option in when we create this new instance of the class back in favorites. This is going to be what helps ensure that when I add a report to my favorites folder, that no other user is going to see that report in their favorites folder as well. From there, we want to make sure that the actual parent ID is going to be set to the ID of the favorites folder. That's what effectively moves a report from one location to another in the system. And then from there, we just want to make sure we're assigning the appropriate access flags. So again, in this case, we're keeping that set to 480 to ensure that we've got the read-only access present across the board. Now, just to go through the same process with the remove from favorites, we'll notice that this method is going to be very similar to the add to favorite method. Same parameters being passed in, constructing the storage management database class the same way, and then calling the remove favorite method. The other thing I would just mention here is we're just throwing up that dialog, and that's where the report name comes into play. This message, as you can see, could be customized or tailored as you see fit. Now, once we call remove from favorite, we're going to do something very similar to when we added something to favorites, except kind of the opposite, if you will. We need to just go and prune that given record that we had previously inserted so that that report shows up in the favorites folder for that given user. So in this case, we again need to grab that favorites folder ID. I've included some options for changing the content access here. Again, I don't see this being something that a lot of folks will be changing, but I just wanted to show that potentially you could if you wanted. And from there, you're going to construct this DB query where we then go and choose to actually delete that specific record. And that's why our where clause here is sort of constructed out in the same way and using all the same criteria, I should say, that we added when we actually inserted the record up above. And this is what ensures that when we go to remove that record from content access, that we're only removing a record specifically for that given user. Some things that we could keep in mind, kind of thinking a little bit forward, is some of these bits of content here might make sense to wrap these in a try catch, so that way if there's any exceptions we bump into, we handle those appropriately. There's a number of other places where we could probably do a little bit of error handling and maybe strengthen this example out a little bit. But for the context of the support lab, I'm keeping things a little bit simple here, just so it's nice and easy to read through all the different code elements. So I'm going to pause for a second. I just want to check in on that questions pane.
Nick, we do have a number of questions, and I can give you a couple now and a couple at the end.
Sure, let's go for it.
Sure. So one question was, in the favorites menu, when you right click, if the report is already in the favorites folder, could you have the menu say remove from favorites instead of add to favorites?
That's a great question. And that's actually part of why in the code base we have all the remove favorite or remove from favorite methods. So I'm going to jump back to the front end and let's grab another advanced report number 3 and let's add that to favorites. Again, I'm just going to cancel my debugger and let's go and just refresh. And if we go to our favorites, now we see that report showing up. And from here, when we click, this is where we're going to have that remove from favorites option. So just to kind of circle back to something we mentioned before, when we were talking about the JavaScript file, I'm going to jump back to Visual Studio and let's go back to the actual JavaScript. That's why we did all this checking to see what the parent node information was of the report that was selected. And this is effectively the equivalence relation that's being checked to determine, do we want to say add to favorites because this report is in some other folder? Or do we want to say remove from favorites because this report is in fact in the favorites folder? So regardless of where the report lives, you should always see the appropriate right-click menu option, and you should almost certainly never see both.
Great. And then another question was, and while we're in the JavaScript, that might be a good place to ask,
Mm.
could you have this favorites option, because this is customization, could this be available to some users and not others?
Yeah, so that's certainly something that you could take into account. If we're talking about exposing it to certain users, what I think you'd probably want to do there is from the session information here, you can actually go into, let me think about this for a second. It's sessioninfo.setup data. In there, you're going to find information about the storage management configuration that's active for that given session. Once you go into that collection, you could actually go and check the specified identity parameters for that session. You could either then pass that identity parameter information into the JavaScript here and maybe do some extra conditional checks to determine whether or not you show this content. You could potentially modify the actual right-click file that you load as well. So again, a couple different options. I would probably go the first of those that I just mentioned, but again, just keep in mind this thing is totally customizable. So if you saw some, other way that you wanted to try to make that work, by all means, you would just have to, code it out and prove it.
Great. I think that's it for now, but I'll circle back at the end with a couple of others.
Okay, sounds good. I think at this point, that's actually going to come to the end of the prepared content that I have for the lab today. So I guess it would just be appropriate to start talking about other questions. And I will also just mention briefly, in case anyone is going to jump off, that our next lab is going to be on August 26th. And we're going to talk about creating KPIs in advanced reports on dashboards, which gives us a little bit of greater flexibility with regards to formatting and visual appearance. So on that note, let's jump over to questions.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of questions came in. One about this specific example is that will the code for this example be something that's available? And to reiterate what you said earlier, there's already on our support site for download a unmodified version of a customized folder storage management, so that if someone wanted to customize storage management, they wouldn't be starting entirely from scratch. They would have an effective code sample that does everything the out of the box behavior does. For your specific customization here with favorites, what I asked the person who asked the question, and anyone else, would be to submit a ticket on our support site to the services team. That way we can track who has this example, and if we make further customizations, we can let you know and update it as well. Nick, the other question to you though is, could you give some, off the top of your head, some other examples of why you might want to customize storage management or other use cases beyond the one you showed here?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Some other things that I can think of off the top of my head are you might consider well, I'll take another client example that I've got that I know we're going to be looking at is you might have a use case where you might automatically want to ensure that any user from any given company sees a company specific folder when they go into the system. And perhaps when a user accesses the system, if that company folder for whatever client site that user is from doesn't already exist, you want that to automatically be generated. That's something that you could potentially look to implement with storage management customization. Um, some other things that you could think of are, potentially really going deep and modifying all of the different calls and whatnot to potentially look at maybe other data sources that you want to use for storage management, saving of the various content and content access records. Well, that's something that would probably be a little bit deeper in scope and something that, if you wanted like our assistance with, we'd probably have to sort of work with you in more of an exploratory manner. The sky is really the limit because at this point we're going to expose sort of the full storage management code base, and you can really tailor and tweak that to your heart's content. And if you really want to go down a path that sort of takes it well above and beyond sort of simple customizations like the one we showed today, by all means, you're more than welcome to. You just got to keep in mind the potential implications of pushing the system out in that direction.
Right. And so just to sort of recap that, that would be if you had a different data source, like a different type of database that isn't one of our supported out of the box, like you wanted to use an ODBC connector or a different type of database, or if you had your own permissioning model already built into your host application and you wanted to rely solely on that and not follow the content access capabilities quite the same way we have here. I think there were a few other questions, but it looks like Tom and Emma and the team answered them individually. And I would say for everyone who did ask questions, really appreciate it. I think there were a lot of really good follow-ups there. But Nick, you can close us out.
Awesome. All right. Thanks again, everybody. And I did just want to reiterate if there's any other nuanced or specific questions or anything that you weren't able to ask on the lab today that you might think about after the fact, please feel free to submit a services ticket and we're more than happy to work with you from there. Thanks again, everybody, and happy reporting.